my clock, it's 4 o'clock, and I think we don't want to waste time. And yeah, let's start with our symposium today. So dear guests, so my name is Martin Schönfelder, and I welcome you in the name of the Technical University and the Faculty of Sports and Health Sciences, and at least also our team of the exercise biology. When I checked the registration date, it was overwhelming for me. So we have several hundreds, I think it was around 800 registrations, and currently we are almost 300 online. So what is the topic of our symposium today? So what we want to talk about, it is endurance science. And why do we choose this topic for today? During the last 3 years, we have done many symposia, always talking about molecular biology and fancy omic science. And therefore, we thought that we should also do a symposium on practical sports science. So many of my colleagues are endurance enthusiasts, and we choose, therefore, endurance science for this topic. So just some examples. So our PhD, Daniel Appelhans, is a triathlete and collaborates with the German Biathlon Association, also working on intermittent exercise. And Melanie Knopp, also a PhD in our lab. She's a sports scientist at a big sports company working on running economy, especially with a world-class marathon runner. So it's quite interesting to have her in our team, and at least Henning Wackerhage, who is also joining us today with a talk. He's my boss, and he's a former triathlete of the German national team. Yeah, to my person, I'm a biologist as well as a sports scientist and also a triathlete as well. And I also work for the Bavarian Triathlon Association as a teacher. But I think you don't want to listen to me, so you want to listen to our speakers. So I will stop my introduction for you. And just before we start, some short rules on our symposium. So please, whenever possible, just turn off the microphone as well as your camera. And if you have a question, please choose below the chat function. So we will try to read all of your comments or your questions. And after each talk, we have reserved 5 minutes for you to put some questions on the speakers, and we will address the questions directly to the speakers. So coming to our first speaker, I want to introduce to you Professor Stefan Seiler. After growing up in the US and earning his doctoral degree at the University of Texas, he lived in Norway. I think it's more or less 20 years. He is a teacher there, also a researcher and group leader, and yeah, worked in many fields of endurance and exercise. He also is working together with the Norwegian Olympic Federation team. He has become internationally known for his research publications and lectures related on organization of training, especially intensity distribution. He worked, his work influenced the international research around training, and especially in the field of the so-called polarized training models. And if you look back on 100 peer-reviewed publications, you will see that he is a famous person in endurance exercise. And yeah, and therefore it's a great pleasure for me to announce you now Stephen Seiler, and he will focusing on intermittent endurance exercise. So I will stop my presentation and I will give over to Stephen Seiler.
Whoops, not able to get to my presentation. Let's see here. Just a second. There it goes. Yes, well, thank you for the invitation. I'm just struggling a little bit. There we go. Thank you for the invitation to this seminar, and it's a challenging topic to deal with endurance enough, and then when we make it intermittent exercise, it's even more challenging. But I'm going to start by discussing the physiology of endurance and then try to layer on top of that this intermittent nature. So if we begin with the basics of our endurance model, many of you will be familiar with this, that we can measure VO2 max of our athlete, that we can determine their fractional utilization without going too deep into the various methods for that. And then we get a sustainable performance VO2, and we can multiply that times their work efficiency or economy, depending on the movement that we're discussing, and that will give us, with a little bit of anaerobic capacity thrown in, will give us a performance velocity or power. And I've made this very small for normally in events of a substantial duration. Of course, the anaerobic capacity component of this performance is essentially negligible, for example, in a marathon. But then if we move out to or shorten the distance to say 3.5, 4 minutes, like a 1500 meter, then the role of the so-called anaerobic capacity becomes decisive. However, both of this model builds on an assumption of a single event, a single continuous duration of very high intensity exercise. And that's the basic model for endurance and the role of anaerobic capacity. So we're going to try to move beyond that. And then we have to ask, well, what is this capacity? We treat it as a fixed or finite amount of energy or work that can be done. We call it anaerobic capacity. What is really going on? Obviously, we need to relate it to the metabolic systems, and we can basically say that when there are very high rates of direct phosphagen depletion and glycolytic phosphorylation, then we're going to have high rates of glycolysis and high rates of energy that are above what the oxidative phosphorylation can support, and we will see these accumulation of a number of different ions and metabolites, and they then will have an inhibitory feedback effect on both key enzymes, but also on muscle contraction. So this capacity we're measuring is kind of it's a construct that, there is no single molecule that we can call the anaerobic capacity molecule, but we are looking at it as a construct to help us understand a very complex set of reactions that are happening. And for example, these various ions have different kinetics. If you look at potassium from Medba and Serstad, you see that there's a very rapid increase and very rapid recovery, whereas if we look at hydrogen ions, H plus, in form of arterial blood pH, we see a different kinetics and a different recovery and so forth. So again, this capacity we're trying to identify is kind of the manifestation of a complex set of morphological, contractile, and metabolic variables that that all have different rate constants and so forth. Anaerobic is an unfortunate term in the sense that it makes us often think about historically that we're turning off aerobic function and on aerobic or on anaerobic, and this is of course inaccurate and incorrect understanding. And so I don't know what the appropriate term would be. Maybe we could call this supra aerobic flux, so it's some type of super aerobic energy flux times a duration, and it's going to be limited by both production rates and this feedback inhibition that occurs. So we end up modeling it as an amount of work that can be performed, and it is essentially a subtraction model. Either you can use the maximum accumulated oxygen deficit approach of Medba, the critical power model from Monod and Scher. You can use Saresa is attributed with the gross efficiency model. All of these have been discussed about 10 years ago in a review. So there are different approaches, but what we can say is that two of these are highly laboratory intensive, whereas the critical power model has at least the benefit of being fairly field testing friendly. So some of what I will talk about will be a little bit more directed towards critical power as we go, just because it is more amenable to collecting data from the field. But if we look a little bit at what these models entail, the maximum accumulated oxygen deficit model was presented. It was based on Krogh and Linhard, but it was Medba and colleagues in 1988 that published this. It's a rigorous approach where first you have to determine the economy or efficiency of the athlete in a whole series of submaximal workloads, and then extrapolate up to the power or pace that the athlete performs a maximum effort at. And then again, you measure oxygen consumption, and you subtract that from the theoretical or assumed oxygen demand. And there are assumptions of linearity and the efficiency and so forth that may be problematic. But you get an accumulated oxygen deficit. And when this is done, you get in O2 equivalents, you get an oxygen deficit that is roughly 1 minute's worth at VO2 max as a crude approximation, about 40 to 80 milliliters per kilogram oxygen equivalents. And there's a reasonable correlation between MAOD and the critical power model. Another aspect of the MAOD is that you need to do at least 2 minutes of continuous effort at maximum to really achieve the true or the highest accumulated oxygen deficit. The other thing that's interesting about this study, and it typifies physiologists, is that often the co-authors are also subjects. So at least 3 of the co-authors were subjects in this study. Tanaka, you will have heard of. Roald Barr's had a long career more on some sports medicine oriented and so forth. Now, if you look at the critical power model, then it's based on the power duration curve. Here I have just used an averaged power duration curve from a cycling team that I work with. They are the next level from World Tour here based in Denmark and Norway. And then we have to select a very specific region of the power duration curve from about 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, to 12 to 15 minutes. And that's a range where there's a lot of interplay between, you might say, the aerobic and anaerobic contributions. And if we then use the linearized model from Maritani, we can then calculate a team averaged critical power, which I've done here, and a team averaged W prime, which is this anaerobic or high energy. It wouldn't be really anaerobic, but the high energy component. And you see this, and we've, over 2 years, at a team level, it doesn't change very much. 1.5 kilojoules plus minus, 5-10 watts plus minus across 2 years. Now, so if we then say, okay, how do we adapt this model to intermittent exercise? Then we've got this buffer, this phosphoglycolytic buffer capacity that is fit within our endurance model. And now we have to think of it more as what we might say is a lot of cars coming out of Germany would be hybrids that are essentially combining a combustion engine with a fairly inexhaustible fuel tank with a battery. And this is essentially what we're doing at the same in a biological context in the body. And now repeated partial discharging of this buffer has to be then recharged from the aerobic system. So obviously this will tend to tell us that the bigger this aerobic capacity is, the bigger the potential to also tap into that glycolytic buffer and partially deplete it and reuse it. So there is an interaction here that is going on during intermittent exercise. And another issue that's different from the car is that the biological context, when our athletes are doing these high intensity intermittent types of efforts, which have become more and more popular in Olympics and so forth because they're TV friendly courses, have led to a more stochastic nature of work. Well, the cost, the internal cost, is increasing relative to the external work during the competition. And this is something that we often will use heart rate to get as a surrogate measure of this uncoupling between the internal work and the external workload. And here's just an example from a typical endurance interval session, 6 times 4 minutes with 2 minutes recovery. This is aggregated data. And you see the typical cardiac drift or uncoupling. It's totally independent of dehydration or so forth. It's essentially a function of central command increase and increased motor unit activation. And if we take, for example, here, I have taken a 5,000 meter time trial on this double polling ergometer. And this is the heart rate response during that 18-minute continuous effort at maximum, it was a maximum 5,000 meter effort. And then I've broken this up into time segments that at exactly the same power output with a 75-second recovery. And here is the 4-minute work bouts. This is the classic idea that if interval training allows us to complete more total work at a given intensity. Well, here's an example of that. But there is a uncoupling. And if we shorten the work bout, same power, we get a different rate of uncoupling, which we can see here. So this is the nature of interval or intermittent work in that time duration, say 2, 3, 5 minutes of work and recovery in the 1 to 5 minute range. But in this range, it doesn't seem that once you move beyond about 1 minute recovery towards 2, the effect of additional recovery time is very limited. And so if we have athletes self-select, blind to time, how much time they need to recover in order to be able to jump on the treadmill and continue running and at the velocity of a previous trial, they self-select on average about 120 seconds or 2 minutes. And if we look at perceived exertion with the same workout interval session with either 1, 2, or 4 minutes, it doesn't have much effect on the uncoupling or the perceived exertion drift that happens during this intermittent work. So that's intervals that are kind of in that 2 to 8 minute range. But what happens if we're looking at even more stochastic work where we're down under a minute in the work bouts? For example, here I've taken a professional cyclist, young athlete, who did, by his own name, he called it a race simulation workout. It spans across 2.5 hours, but he did 3 blocks of 10 minutes or 10 times 60-30. In the 60-second work periods, he's at about 500, 550 watts. In the 30-second work periods, he's a recovery, so say at 250. Here's the heart rate response. There's a drift upward within the block, and there's an overall slight drift upward despite the 30-minute recoveries in between. And heart rate is what we're using as this measure. Now, if I take these 3 work periods and then look at the energetics of them, or look at the work outputs, the work periods were at about 520 on average, and heart rate drifted upward. The utilization of W prime, which maybe this athlete has, say, 28, 29 kilojoule W prime based on a critical power test, he has expended about 3 or 4 times that, 3.5 times at least, in each of these 10-minute work blocks. So clearly there is a restitution or recovery, partial recovery during the work that's allowing for the accumulation of a fairly large quantity of this high intensity work. Now, if I think about, well, how can I be even more precise at measuring this, the relationship between work and recovery, or work and low intensity power output? Well, here's a very basic approach. I can say, and I'm just going to exemplify it with a theoretical workout of 8 times 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, 400 watts during the work period, 100 watts during the recovery period. And this particular athlete has a critical power of 300 watts. Okay. So now I have these work periods where they're, in this square wave scenario, it's 100 watts times 30 seconds here. So that would be 3 kilojoules. And then I've got the recovery, you might call it this negative or recovery energy that's a function of both time and how far below the critical power. Now, this is modeled here just as if every second is the same. In reality, we suspect that that's not the case, but we can do a little bit of math and we can get an accumulated W prime utilization and then a ratio of the work above and work below the critical power. And we can adjust it, for example, a 10-minute as given a given 10-minute period. Now, again, we know that this period of recovery should probably be modeled as a non-linear function, such that seconds of work at a much lower power output have a bigger effect on recovery than seconds very close to the critical power. But I've just approached this from a very simple work above, work below type standard. And so if we use that methodology, go back to this data from the athlete, and now I'm going to not only throw in some metrics for how he has performed this work recovery duty cycle, and I can get his kilojoules of work above critical power, a ratio of the work above and the work below, the work time integral as a ratio. It's about 4 kilojoules or 4 joules per joule of recovery in these work bouts. And then you get a kind of a high intensity repeatability index. And then I've also added ventilation data because we're using here a wearable technology that allows us to measure ventilation rate and tidal volume and so forth. And so you see with ventilation, I would say we're seeing a more clear picture of the fact that these work bouts are definitely not steady state. He's not in a quasi steady state. He's actually mobilizing more and more with each repetition, and peak respiratory frequencies are hitting very high values, 78, 80, 283 in these second bouts. And I think that's consistent with the mobilization, the cost, and the perceived exertion. And Andrea Nicolo from Rome has done some beautiful work showing that it seems respiratory frequency is very tightly coupled to perceived exertion, more so than heart rate. So, and then if we take a much poorer athlete, a 57-year-old professor who lives in Norway now for 25 years, and I do 3 times 10 minutes on Zwift, chasing avatars in front of me. So I call this bridging intervals. And so it's somewhat freestyle. And I've got 3 blocks of 10 minutes. And I've done the same type of calculation. Well, first of all, my W prime, my rate of production of this high energy work is much lower, but just manipulating the time, the duty cycle. Here I use much shorter but higher power outputs for only 8 to 12 seconds. Here I use work bouts of 30 to 90 seconds. And so I can generate more, you say W prime, using this approach. However, the average power output is lower. The repeatability index here is about the same, but then I kind of fall apart, and this third block has a much lower repeatability index, and my breathing frequency is hitting 80 at the end. And here also I would just show that the picture of heart rate versus the picture of ventilation is very different. So it seems that ventilation is capturing the internal workload and what you might call it the mobilization demand better than heart rate during these kinds of stochastic work. So we're interested in moving ventilation measurement into the field. Now, all right, so competition scenarios. What's happening? Well, we know we've got our typically even-paced races. This is what we've modeled. Our endurance model of the physiology is based on essentially steady-state, even-paced races. Then we have our long body management challenges like an Ironman triathlon or ultra and so forth, where the limitations may become, different, just depletion-oriented problems. And then we have what essentially is the most popular and the most viewer-friendly, the events that the Olympics wants to hold on to or create even more of, which are these wars of attrition that are highly variable, highly strategic and so forth, and are highly intermittent in nature. So traditional steady state activities like the cycling portion of a triathlon are now much more intermittent work because of the courses. 90-degree turns and short hills and so forth result in a much more intermittent power profile. So some examples. Of course, mountain bike is a very good example of a highly intermittent endurance activity. This is a national championship race. The file was given to me from a Czech Republic rider during the national championship, and you see 8 laps, highly stochastic from 1,000 watts down to 0 watts, broken up into the different laps. The maximum power, this is the raw normalized power. In other words, no smoothing that you would get, for example, from training peaks. Here is the athlete's average percentage of maximum heart rate for the entire race, about 95%. Here is the utilization above critical power, or the W prime utilization. You see it starts very high and then fades somewhat downward. Here is that W prime to recovery prime ratio. It is sliding downward, and the high intensity repeatability index is sliding downward. And this is why the athlete took contact. He said, I'm fading during these races. And this prompted me to say, well, how do I measure that? Because these look similar, but now, this is at least an approach to quantifying what is happening relative to the physiological cost. And so this is what we've done here. Again, but if we look at his average heart rate is 95% across. So a very steady output physiologically, and then a slowly declining power output. And if we break up the segments or the accumulation of these work above red line segments, with the red line being critical power here, you can see how they're distributed. And most of them are under 2 kilojoules in segment magnitude. But there are significant segments of 5+, at least early in the race. And so if we look another way at this performance, we can say, well, from an active muscle point of view, we see a very polarized power profile. And this is the only way you can achieve such high, you might say, accumulation, W prime accumulation, is to also have periods of very low power output to allow for this restitution to occur. But if you look at it from a cardiovascular point of view, basically the heart is sensitive to oxygen demand, or the cardiac output is correlated with oxygen demand, and that's high the entire time. And so you see very different distributions for cardiovascular versus active muscle in these intermittent efforts. Now, most of the W prime utilization events during intermittent work are very short, under 15 seconds in duration, hundreds of them in total in a 98-second race, but almost all are under 15 seconds in duration. And this is consistent with the physiology, which says if we keep the work bout duration very short, the contribution of the lactic or anaerobic glycolysis is also controlled or minimized to an extent. So one more athlete I'll show you is Mathieu van der Poel. This is from Strade Bianche. He won in 2021. It was a wonderful race. The world champion was on his tail. The Tour de France winner was on his tail. And this is the 4-hour and 45-minute power file with heart rate. We can basically do a 30-second smoothing and get this using heart rate reserve and 6-minute power as calibrations. And we see that the real race begins at 3 hours. So the last 2 hours here. And if we look further, we can then use that same approach and see how this, the W prime accumulation changes, but also the ratio, the density of efforts is shifting. And we're seeing this in the data, and especially over the last 105 minutes. But this athlete, Mathieu van der Poel, is generating, using this critical power model and the best estimates we can make for his critical power, he's producing about 25, 26 kilojoules for every 10 minutes on average during this race. So it's a tremendously intermittent endurance effort. And again, here's the heart rate profile, quite well distributed. Here's the power profile, which is quite polarized, with 101 minutes of work accumulated above his estimated critical power. And that was based on numerous race files. So with that, I will open up for questions, and hopefully I've held myself within the time limit.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen, for this fascinating talk. So we have one question. Maybe it's directly from another speaker, from Henning. Maybe he can announce his question directly.
Well, it wasn't really a question, but I've been involved with Alois Mader, and he is this model of human energy metabolism. So I think it would be really fascinating, excuse me, to simulate how phosphocreatine, how the rate of lactate production, and how that changes over this exercise. But if I now can ask also a specific question, I mean, once you go into glycolysis, you have a high glycogen depletion. And how do people actually manage so many efforts at such a high intensity without glycogen depleting? Because if you're glycogen depleted, you can't do the high effort anymore.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. I guess obviously these athletes are very gifted, and not all of them are able to be competitive after 4 hours at that level. So there do seem to be some adaptations, some genetics that are associated with the difference between a classics podium contender and a domestique that will exhaust their reserves and have to basically drop out, or slide down. So it's amazing, but I also can say that they are at least conserving as best they can glycogen. They are consuming 90 to 100 grams per hour exogenous glucose during the races. And one of their big issues is just gut adaptations to be able to tolerate the intake of such high volumes of glucose. And some of them say that they fatigue. That also is a fatigue issue, that they struggle to continue that rate of intake over so many hours.
Thank you.
Okay, there are two questions in the chat. So first question from David Rogers. Stephen, do you use the 60-minute critical power when you're estimating critical power?
Well, I'm a diehard, and I would argue that the 60 minutes would be the way to go, but that's not what's happening. So I have to bow to the pressure of the realities of testing, and that's generally been the more of the 0.95 times 20 minutes has been more typically used.
Okay, second question from Henrik Falkenito. Since these efforts are occurring in the anaerobic power reserve domain, do you see an important rule for the APR in intermittent events?
Do I see an important
rule for the APR? I do not know exactly what APR is.
I guess I'm missing something in the lingo here. Maybe he could voice the question.
It's actually in the chat.
I sent it to you, the question directly into the chat.
Yeah.
You can read it. Maybe it's easier then.
Q&A. Let's see. In the anaerobic power reserve domain, do you see an important role for the APR in intermittent events? Well, yeah. So in other words, you're asking, how does it matter how big the W prime is if we use that lingo? Um, and I don't know. I'm not sure. What I do know is this: there's been research from Losnagor. There's been others that show that during races, if we take cross country skiing, where they've simulated a 15-kilometer event that lasts about 40 minutes, that they use the maximum oxygen MAOD model, showed that the athletes were accumulating about 3.5 to 4 times their MAOD, but they were doing it in very small fractions of the maximum accumulated oxygen deficit, on average about 14%, meaning that the work bouts are not encroaching on the true MAOD or the true critical power, because it's not, it will get you dropped in a race. If we put it into the lingo of reality, if you go too deep into that anaerobic reserve, you will have all this buildup of metabolic byproducts, and you will fatigue, you will lose power output. So they use very judiciously use small amounts of their W prime. So maybe that means that you don't have to have a huge W prime, but you need to have a big endurance capacity and the ability to go back and forth.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next 3 short questions result from Pierre Hausemer. Can you recommend literature concerning ventilation, breathing frequency, and mobilization of energy?
Well, one of the persons that I find to be doing some of the most exciting work right now is a guy named Andrea Nicolo in Rome. And he has done some very nice work and just published an extensive review on the regulation of breathing, which their argument is that the inputs for the regulation of tidal volume and the inputs for the regulation of breathing frequency are quite different. And so breathing frequency tracks very well with, you might say, mobilization demand or perceived exertion. So I think there's some very interesting reading to do from Nicolo and colleagues, at least as one source. I'm not saying I'm sure there are others, but that's one source I can recommend.
Okay, do you think that modern watches or chest straps are measuring accurate the ventilation or breathing?
No, not at all. Don't think so. They could be, but they're not. And the reason is, let's just be honest, the heart rate manufacturers want to do as little extra hardware manufacturing as possible, and they want to solve things with algorithms. So they're measuring heart rate, and they're trying to use the respiratory influence on the heart rate, variability to estimate breathing characteristics. So it's several layers removed from the primary measure. Whereas what we're doing with wearables technology is we're actually measuring the thoracic excursion and looking at frequency and then trying to make some estimates of volume. And that's a very different approach, and it's much more accurate. It's not perfect, but it's much better than trying to achieve this via layers of data smoothing from a heart rate variability measurement.
Okay, I think we can just give one more question. What do you think about breathing training like the Spiro Tiger from the Swiss company?
Well, this is an interesting. Jerome Dempsey just did a beautiful podcast. Jerome is 84 years old. He's as smart as they come on all things ventilation, and he presented some interesting new information about how this breathing training might be working. And so I think we need to go back to some of these questions with new technologies and new approaches. I don't know the answer to that. My training has been that ventilation is not the limiting factor. If you have healthy lungs, that ventilation is essentially never the limiting factor in endurance. But I do believe that that's probably a truth with modifications, and we have the potential to go back to some of these questions with a bit more nuanced understanding. So I think there's some interesting things to do in the area of breathing.
Okay, so I think we have to go to our next talk. So maybe we can clarify some questions if we have time in the end. So our next speaker is Professor Véronique Villard, and yeah, just some words for the introduction to her. So at the age of 22 years, Véronique was a high-level runner and cross-skier. And at this age, she decided to dedicate her life to the science of training. By using physiological and individual training programs, she wanted to be more efficient in training and to avoid sport burnouts. Véronique became professor at the age of 28 years. I found in the literature, so several years later, she became a full professorship and created an INSERM lab focusing on new ways for intelligent training. And now she can look back on more than 3 decades of research on aging and multidimensional monitoring of athletes and analyzing of training and its improvement. She wrote around 7 books and 130 international papers and formed generations of trainers. And if we go into statistics of marathon running, currently every year around 1.3 million people run a marathon all around the world, and most of them are recreational athletes. Therefore, it is an important focus on cardiorespiratory responses in training, as well as during a marathon for performance, as well as for health reasons. And so let's say bonjour, Véronique, and
bonjour.
Great pleasure for us to have you here, and we want to listen to you now.
At first, hello to everyone. I am very proud to be among you. At first, sorry for my Parisian accent. We are familiar to write English, but not to speak. Partage d'écran. Diaporama. C'est là. Okay. So I'm going to speak to you about cardiorespiratory responses during the marathon in recreational runners and their training based on field measurement. It's an overview of all my works, of course. It's a short time, and be cool. All the references are available for free on my internet site following this address. So, as you said, there is a huge increase of the participant in the marathon in Berlin. Of course, you can see it's multiplied by 200, and the same in Paris in the same times. As said Professor Stephen said previously, according to the model of Pietro Di Pampero, the marathon, there is of course no much anaerobic contribution. The marathon is equal to a fractional value of the VO2 max, the velocity associated with VO2 max. And we are looking for trying to target their marathon speed according the VO2 max, and they try to focus on the fractional use they are able to sustain for a marathon. Also, there another way they try to focus on this magic velocity they can sustain for a marathon according the maximum lactate steady state. Here is it's not very difficult to measure it. We propose easy way with only 2 steady state, 2 exercise of 20 minutes, one easy and one heavy, in order to try to focus on the exact value of lactate at which there is a steady state, and the exact value of speed at which there is a steady state of lactate. Of course, some researchers try to say that maybe the velocity at the marathon is equal to 90% of the maximum lactate steady state velocity. But you know that the maximum lactate steady state of the lactate is very variable according to the athletes. So we also try to use the model of critical speed presented previously by the Professor Seiler, and we calculate that the high level, the elite athletes are able to sustain for 94% of their critical speed along the marathon. It's very, very close to the critical speed, and it's much lower for recreational runner, about at 80% of the critical speed. We can also try to estimate the velocity on the right velocity on a marathon according to the speed on the 3K. We measure the best marathoner in Portugal. It was a long time ago. We went in Porto and we asked to Antonio Pinto and other very high level marathon runners, female and male, to sustain a 10K at their marathon velocity, and thereafter we asked them to sprint for 1 kilometer. Just after they have no mean for recovery, and we saw that they were able to sustain velocity of a marathon at 85% of their velocity on 3,000 meters. And you can see that Antonio Pinto was a very fast runner on 10K and also on 3K. So it means that, and we saw that the predictor of a performance on the marathon, it was the ability. It was not VO2, it was not the fractional use of VO2 max during the V marathon, it was not the efficiency, it was the ability to effectively run as fast as possible 1 kilometer just after the 10K run at their marathon velocity. So it means that maybe you are right, the anaerobic metabolism would make the difference in high level runners. And you can see here that when we do an analysis, present analysis of the best female and male marathon runners, we can see that marathon is not a perfect constant speed run, and indeed there is much variation. And maybe the anaerobic metabolism could be not only discriminant of the performance for high-level athletes, but also a good way to a good strategy to allowing you to have a variable speed and to have a kind of intermittent exercise, I would say, and to have a mean of optimizing the metabolism, all the metabolism with a synergic contribution of anaerobic, aerobic, and not a constant load velocity. So it's very inspiring for recreational runners. It means that maybe it would be good to have a start fast, to be convex-like, rather than to be concave-like. We compare good race for Kipchoge in Berlin for this too, and it was not good in Dubai, and he ran like that, and he ran like that. So we decided to look after the distribution of a marathon asymmetry, to look after the statistical signature of it's a kind of polarized race between high and low velocity. And the best strategy for running, even for recreational runners, is to have a median speed which must be below the average speed. That means that after a start fast, you can have a recovery to be lazy race, but efficient race, and to be able to increase the velocity and to have a positive, to have a negative split according the pace. So be lazy for running a success marathon. And it's a pity that recreational runners rather try to target, as I said before, a right velocity, and they try to sustain velocity. Here it's in percentage of VO2 max as long as possible before they hit the wall. That's why the average velocity is below the median velocity. It means that they run for nothing at high speed, because at the end, the speed is decreasing so much that the average velocity is below the median velocity. They run it's not a clever run, indeed. But that's why there is, you can see that when they hit the wall, the speed decrease, but the heart rate is continue to increase. And then the speed decrease so much that the heart rate decrease also. So maybe the best way for running a marathon is to do that according to the ball scale, the feeling of your race. And at this moment, we can recommend to follow your RPE, your ball scale. Most of the ball scale on the marathon is equal to 14 value, but you can see here that we ask all the runners to give, we register what they feel, and we can see that there are some different RPE dynamics according the runners. It's not systematically the same for everyone. So it's very difficult to recommend ball scale, a defined ball scale for everyone to say. It is impossible to say, okay, you have to run at 14. So in my, at this moment, I would say that the new paradigm for training for the marathon is to be familiar with variable speed versus constant speed. So I do agree to practice interval training, even for marathon, especially for the marathon, and to have a strategy of increasing the power reserve, which is the key for endurance. In my opinion, it's not the good strategy to try to do a tempo training at the marathon, because you lose your glycogen for nothing. And I do recommend to my recreational runner to increase the power reserve. I'm going to tell you how, and to adopt an acceleration training. This allows a fast start, and training using a set pace with a simplified RPE scale. You can adopt the easy, medium, hard, and very hard RPE. So human, it's a good news that human is able to self-pace acceleration. It means that you are completely able to rather to follow a strict interval training as 40 seconds. You can use acceleration modeling for your training. It's enough to do that. You can stimulate your metabolism as you do some interval training. It's an example of what we recommend for our recreational runners. We have an application on a software via training, and it's just a color code, and they have every 2 days, every 3 days, a training session. Here it's for increasing the anaerobic metabolism. So you have an example. It's easy pace. They accelerate. It's a hard acceleration, and it's the most difficult. Slow deceleration before a rest, recovering, and again. And you know that we demonstrated in a prior publication that we were able to sustain VO2 max a long time, even when you decrease the speed. VO2 max is keeping a maximum. So it's a very efficient and difficult training indeed, but very efficient. We check it on animals because in my INSERM lab, all I try in a human, I check it on animal, And we saw that this kind of training increased both mitochondria and myofilament and myofibrils in muscle and in heart. So it's a very efficient training session. The same easy pace, it's here an acceleration from easy pace, medium, hard, and here decreasing. When you recover, when you have a recovery like that, you work still, you will still work, and so it's very efficient. And you can see it's only 2 acceleration and deceleration, and it lasts only 20 minutes. You can see here that we could, in some athletes, sustain VO2 max for almost 30 minutes, thanks to decreasing of speed rather than increasing it. And it's why I had the idea of deceleration training. It's in a way, it's a lazy training too. And we also try to increase the power reserve by this kind of training session, asking the runners to have a great acceleration for 10 seconds every 3 minutes. They enjoy this training session. So I would say try it. You can try it and on the internet site. We check that on many hundreds of runners that this training session in only this training method in only 3 months allowed to increase the maximal velocity highly significantly in the 200 recreation runners, male and females. They are not professional, they are as everyone, and they enjoy to have a feeling training with acceleration, and every training doesn't last more than 30 minutes. That's why it's very easy to include it in real life with family and works. So it's perfect, and it works in a very old people too. It's a man who is 84 years old, and he is able to run the marathon in more than 4 hours. Thank you very much. Have you any question?
Thank you very much for your nice talk. And I will check the chat. There's one question from David Rogers. So it seems very similar to Emil Zatopek fartlek system. It is linked, or is it linked in any way?
Oh, I would say that I read the book, the biography of Emil. I would say that Emil Zatopek repeated 100 times 400 meters at his lactate threshold velocity. I calculate it was indeed, in reality, he did interval training at his velocity at his lactate threshold. So it's not the same, because he tried to be constant, to maintain a constant speed at the 400 meters indeed, and he repeated it for 100 times. So it was not a lazy work. I do prefer to have a huge acceleration, not for a very long time, and not with many repetitions, and not more than 30 minutes.
Okay, and the next question is from Pierre Hausemer. When talking about your method with the 50 seconds acceleration and 5 minutes deceleration, how would that look like in practice?
In practice, you just try, you don't need anything, no device. You just try to accelerate for 14 seconds and decrease. And after, you can check with your heart rate and speed measurement. Only after, you can check if your curve it looks like what we design with color.
Are there any recommendations for very high speed and the deceleration?
Yes, they try to accelerate until the maximal speed. According to the color, red color is heavy zone, and very heavy zone, and the green is easy, and the orange is medium. So they just follow the color.
Okay.
I forgot to say you that before we have a test which the name is Rabbit, which has been validated, and this test allow for everyone to check the different zone, what is green, orange, and red, according the percentage of VO2 max and VO2 max. So we validated this test in 2 years ago. One of my students did a PhD about that. It is the Rabbit test. All the publication is available on the internet site.
Okay, next question from Ramon Pujol. Do you recommend HIIT training during the specific phase of training for a marathon?
Of course I do. My training method is also HIIT training based on feeling, only based on feeling and acceleration. There is no phase of maintain this. When we try to maintain velocity, it's very painful. And what is efficient is the acceleration phase, because strength, according Newton equation, strength depends on acceleration multiplied by the mass. And you know that during a marathon, when you hit the wall, you are not anymore efficient, because you lose your elasticity and your energy cost of running is increasing, and you have no anymore glycogen, and you are less efficient. It's very hard, because one of my PhD students measured the efficiency during a marathon, and we saw that the energy cost of running is double, because you run sitting. I can't demonstrate you, but you sit at this moment. You don't once, because you have no strength anymore. And a marathon runner need strength. They need strength, and strength is not to pull weight. It's by acceleration that you can increase your strength and your power reserve, which allow you to have variation during marathon, and to have a synergy between metabolism, and to have a recovery, and not to try to maintain a speed, which is a fast string speed, because it's difficult to maintain the speed very exactly. I don't know how.
Okay, next practical question from an anonymous person. So how do you pace training times if they don't want to use a watch or heart rate, if RPE is quite different between these runners, what you have shown in your graphs?
Yes, I recommend to start at medium speed. Between medium and hard, of course, when you start a marathon, there is a rush. You start fast. It's automatically. But I encourage to do that for at least 1 or 2 kilometers before to decrease it. So I would say start fast at a medium hard feeling, and once you have run for 2 kilometers, you can decrease, and to keep a medium feeling. What I recommend, and to try to accelerate after the 25 kilometers if you can, but it's possible. And because when you have decreased the speed, you can try again to have a little acceleration, and as a collier de perles, you can like that, and little. It's a kind of fractal curve.
Okay, Simon Hayden asked for what do you think of the classic workout of 40 seconds of hard work and 20 seconds of easy, using 8 to 10 repetitions and 1 to 3 series.
It's good. It's good if you don't try to sustain the speed. 40 seconds like that and 20 seconds like that. You know, it's very difficult to try. You lose your glycogen and you can train so much because when you try to sustain the speed, it's inefficient. The most efficient is to work by positive and negative acceleration. I'm convinced on that because it's efficient and you will recover day from day. It's very easy to have a recovery with this kind of acceleration. Deceleration is trying to sustain one hard velocity.
Okay, next question again from Pierre Hausemer. I think it relates to the speed variation during the marathon, and he asked, have you observed the same patterns in 10-kilometer races?
Yes, I did observe the same, but I have not written paper on that still. So at this moment, I would not say, yes, I recommend to do the same, but we have still to publish about that. We saw the same things, yes.
Okay, next from Patrick Wahl. Recently, there have been some publications on durability, fatigue resistance. What is the best way to train durability, in your opinion?
Durability? What does it mean?
Yeah, durability.
You may say
resistance.
fatigue
resistance. But resistance against fatigue.
Yeah, yes. I don't understand the question indeed. Fatigue is the inability for sustaining a speed, but resistance, you may say anaerobic capacity or resistance. I don't. Could you precise your question? What does it mean, resistance?
Okay, maybe Patrick Wahl, maybe you can write it more clearly. So I will go to the next possible form. Recently, there is a term, it's the same durability. Yeah, I think it goes in the, maybe these two questions we have to put at the end.
Maybe you can send my email to,
yeah,
I will answer.
I think that's the best way. But I also have a question on my own. You mentioned these variation in the speed. If you compare good marathon runners and not so good marathon runners, is there a link to the distribution? So does a better marathon runner has a less variation or a higher variation?
You are right. We have many papers done performed with mathematicians. My last papers on the internet side, and we saw that the performance depends on the ability to run between extreme value with a high coefficient of variation. The best runners are able to have a big coefficient of variation of their speed, and the recreational runners are not able to do that because they have no anaerobic power reserve. They are like diesel. They try to with the tempo training, they try to be able to sustain a very high percentage of VO2 max, but they level off. They can increase their performance. That's why they say, oh, I don't want to do marathon anymore. I'm going to do ultra trail or something like that because they are disappointed not to have an improvement of their performance because they try to be very endurant and their performance is level off. They are able to run at 90% of 80% of VO2 max until the wall, and when they hit the wall, the speed decreases at 50% of the VO2 max. So for answering to your question, yes, the big difference is that the recreational runners are not able to have a speed variation.
Okay. Do you last question? Do you think if we have a motorized pacemaker, so
yes,
given that always the exact same speed, and I have to run this speed, could I improve my marathon pace or not?
Yes, the future of a pace runner is to protect the runners of wind, but to look to follow the natural speed variation of the runner they help. They are just like here for the wind. That's it. And they must be able to with the eye behind to see what is going naturally the runner. No, that's the future of a pacer. They're just here for the wind.
Okay.
Then not for getting an artificial pace.
Thank you very much for answering all these questions.
But for all the questions I see, you can ask me on internet, my email, and I will answer to everyone.
Okay, thank you very much for this offer. And I think it's time to go to the next talk. Thank you very much again, Veronique, for your talk. And we will switch over to Henning Wackerhage. So I just gave you here his image. So Professor Wackerhage studied and obtained his doctorate at the German Sport University in Cologne. After his time in Cologne, he moved to UK and became a lecturer in sports physiology at the University of Lancaster, Dundee, as well as in Aberdeen. Right before the Brexit, he returned to Germany and got the position as an associate professor here at our faculty for sports biology in the year of 2016. Henning is a molecular exercise physiologist and has published several textbooks in this field, and is specifically interested in molecular mechanisms by which exercise improves fitness and health. Focal points of his research are the role of so-called hippoproteins, which are involved also in cancer. Especially the interest is what is the function of these hippoproteins in skeletal muscle. Further, he is focusing on the muscle aging and genetics of muscle mass, muscle fiber distribution, as well as the function of these different muscle fibers. Yeah, but today he will give us a talk on the history of one of the most important metabolites in sports science. So let's dive now into the history of 60 years of lactate research. And I give over to Henning.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Welcome, everyone. And I know some of the people I'm talking about. Hermann Heck, they're listening here. And to me and many others who studied with them, they're real legends. And so what I would like, my talk is entitled Development of Modern Lactate Testing by the Cologne Sports Medicine Group in the 1970s and 1980s. And together with former students and friends, we've just published a review in Frontiers of Physiology about it. And so the first question is, why our interest in the history of lactate and the lactate threshold and the anaerobic threshold? Well, so I'm normally a molecular exercise physiologist. And one of the reasons is in the 1990s, when I was studying in Cologne, everyone was doing lactate. And to me, it was simply too many people doing lactate, so that I decided I go molecular. But then I followed the field, of course, and I saw what my teachers were doing. And then I saw this review in the Journal of Physiology, The Anaerobic Threshold, 50 Years of Controversy, by David Poole, Harry Rossiter, George Brooks, and Bruce Gladden. And the only thing they wrote about the work of Wildo Hollmann, Hermann Heck, and Alois Mader, and then also the Freiburg group, was similar ideas were advanced by them, but did not receive recognition equivalent to Wassermann's efforts, perhaps because much of the research was published in German. Also, their results and explanations were based on blood lactate determinations and did not benefit from breath-by-breath gas exchange technology. And I thought to myself, well, this looks a bit funny because, I mean, this is a big review about thresholds and anaerobic thresholds. And to my knowledge, as a molecular exercise physiologist, there was much more going on in Cologne, and there were also publications in English. So, and as a result, I appreciate that it's very difficult to really include work that is different in a different language. But I just wrote a letter and said, well, actually try to highlight what the contributions were. And I was supported greatly by Hermann Heck in this effort. And then I thought, actually, there's much more. So I teamed up with Sebastian Gehlert, Henry Schulz, Sebastian Weber, Susanne Ring-Dimitriou, and Olli Heine, and greatly supported by Hermann Heck. And we wrote this review about what the Cologne group did. And I'd like to introduce you to their work. So what did the Cologne Sports Medicine Group contribute towards anaerobic threshold concepts? Here's actually the team. So this is not the Beatles. This is actually the Sports Medicine Group in Cologne in the 1970s. And what you see is here is Wildo Heumann. He was a fantastic teacher, and unfortunately he died last year. He was a legend in Cologne, and he gave lectures well in his 90s to students. And this was really, if you could choose between cinema with your girlfriend or going to Wildo Heumann's lecture, the choice was always going to Wildo Heumann's lecture. Then there's Hermann Heck here, who's listening today. And so Hermann Heck is, of course, famous for the MAXLAS, or MLSS, the maximal lactate steady state. Then here's Richard Rost, who was heading the institute at one time, but unfortunately passed away. And here's Alois Mader, and Alois Mader is also one of the brains behind all the work in Cologne. And so I'm really honored to be able to present a little bit of their work today. So just to highlight that this group is just not a backwater where no one cared about. Actually, Claude Bouchard went to Cologne, and he considers Wildo Heumann as his first mentor. And he published several papers, I think 5 or 6 papers together with Wildo Heumann. And I think Wildo Heumann also influenced greatly Claude Bouchard's career, who then went on to study human variability and sport and exercise genetics. And this is what Claude Bouchard says in a recent review. At 23 years of age, it became clear that research and the scientific paradigms were my future. And then he didn't know really what to do. And he said, this led me to Cologne, Germany, where I spent 1.5 years at the Institute of Kreislaufforschung and Sport Medicine of the Deutsche Sporthochschule with Professor Wildo Heumann, my first mentor. So Wildo Heumann was not only important in Cologne, but also important to the career of one of the most distinguished sport and exercise scientists that we know, which is Claude Bouchard. So Wildo Heumann did some research and did a lot of exercise testing. And this is actually data from 1995 from a publication from 1961. And so I just switch on that I have a pointer here. And so what he noted in those days, at least that's what he says in one of the later articles, and this is a translation from German into English, suddenly something caught my eye. There was a point on the ordinate from which ventilation, the respiratory equivalent of the arterial lactate level, and a few other variables, and now I have to move this bit on my slide, suddenly began to increase intensely. So I think he noted that there was a deflection point in ventilation and also in arterial lactate. And of course, later, Carmen Wasserman did much more out of this. But I think in 1959, before Carmen Wasserman coined the phrase anaerobic threshold, I think Wildo Heumann identified some aspects of it. And I think this is not much appreciated in the English-speaking world. So moving to the next slide. So yeah, then Wildo Heumann actually met Arthur Steinhaus. He was an American from Chicago, and Steinhaus came to Germany, and he is one of the founders of the ACSM, and he is also a member of the medical faculty in Chicago. And he visited Wilhelm Knipping, who was the boss of Wildo Heumann in Cologne. And Knipping showed Hollmann's data to Steinhaus, and Steinhaus must have been really impressed because he invited Wilder Hollmann for a keynote to Chicago. And so in 1959, then Wilder Hollmann went to Chicago, and this was at the time of the Pan-American Games, and there was a conference. It was the third Pan-American Congress of Sports Medicine in Chicago, and there were delegates from 38 countries. And Wilder Hollmann presented this data, which are sort of linked to the anaerobic threshold. And so the delegates must have been impressed by it, because Wilder Hollmann then won an honorary medal at the Chicago conference. And this paper from 2001 from Wilder Hollmann, this is where he describes what he contributed towards ideas towards the ventilatory and lactate threshold. So moving on. So this is actually the program, just to show that that this actually took place. So thanks to the Chicago Library, because I asked them, and I wanted to know whether actually Karlmann Wasserman was attending this conference, but I couldn't find that out. But this is sort of the program of the Sports Medicine Congress in Chicago. And this is Arthur Steinhaus, who was Hollmann host, and he was one of the founders of the ACSM. And then Hollmann also wrote a report here in 1959 about that conference, where he said that what he had presented about his ideas, which are linked to what Karlmann Wasserman later termed the anaerobic threshold. And he said, actually, he was really impressed by the Americans, how they investigated their athletes and gave support to their athletes. But he also said that he was quite surprised that the science by the Americans didn't seem to be quite as exciting as the science that was going on in Germany at the time. So that might give you a feeling what the situation was. So the Cologne group then carried on, and this is now after Karlmann Wasserman published his research on the anaerobic threshold and actually coined the phrase anaerobic threshold. And then in 1976, the Cologne group published a paper in German, which is a fantastic paper, but unfortunately it's not known very much in the English-speaking world. And so instrumental to this paper is Alois Marder. Alois Marder came from the former East Germany, and he fled into the West. And he then soon became part of the group of Wilder Hollmann. And so the publication you see here is Wilder Hollmann, it's Alois Marder, Liesen is there, Hermann Heck is part of the group, Filippi and Ross. So these are people who contributed to this group. And it was published in German in Sportarzt and Sport Medicine. And so one important thing in this paper is a technical innovation, because Alois Marder had managed before, when he was still in East Germany with a chemist called Hase, to really change lactate the measurement of lactate. And what he did is he managed to really do lactate measurements in microsamples, which is illustrated here. So you see the earlobe, that's what people do today. And you have a little capillary, and you have a couple of microliters of blood, and you don't need milliliters of arterial blood to measure lactate. And this was, of course, a big technological or methodological advance. And then they used this method, and they did a lot of experimentation, and I would like to show you some data. So here is data of 6 weeks of endurance training. And so what they then investigated, they did 3 variables which respond and adapt to training. So the first is the Sportherz, as it's called in German, or the athlete's heart. And what you see is, this is, I think, a determination by X-ray. And you see it hardly changes from 1,010 milliliters to 1,090 milliliters. So that's the estimated volume. So you don't see much of a change after the training. The second variable is illustrated here. This is a line pre-training, and the dotted line here is a train after training. And they found that the VO2 max actually didn't show the adaptation to the training. There's just a tiny change. But where they saw a huge change is in the lactate curve. So this is a lactate curve pre-training. So this is the old unit, power unit. So they didn't use watt in those time, but essentially it's equivalent to power. And what they saw is they got the classical rightward shift. And this really demonstrated that if you want to have a biomarker for endurance capacity, the change in the lactate curve, that is actually the best biomarker of the three biomarkers, at least in this individual. And so they also proposed a lactate threshold, or they actually called it anaerober Übergang. So the transition from purely aerobic work to mixed anaerobic aerobic work. And for simplicity, they assumed a lactate threshold of 4 millimoles as a criterion. So the power or the running velocity you had at 4 millimoles of lactate, that was a biomarker for endurance capacity. So this 1976 paper should really, really be translated into English because there's some amazing data in there. So here they present data of two athletes. One athlete had a heart size of 1,470 milliliters. The other one, 762. I struggle to read it, but I think it must be around that. And so they also had the VO2 data here, but it's old units. And then they have the lactate data. And so the data, because you can't see how much watts that is, because today everyone looks at everything in watts. Might be not so interesting, but what is interesting is the identity of these two individuals. I can't tell you the names, but it was in the 1970s, and they describe it as the most successful professional cyclist in the world in 1976. And there's clearly only one cyclist in the 1970s who won the Tour de France several times, who was the most successful cyclist of the time, and who fits that description by Alois Marder and others. And this cyclist is really a legend, and it is the best, to many people, the best cyclist of all times. And many people will guess who that cyclist could have been. And as far as I know, that cyclist actually was in Cologne, and they have tested him, probably out of season though. And then there is what they describe the world's best extreme long distance runner. And in Cologne at the time, there was a runner who was a world champion over 100 kilometers. And he also held the world record in the 100-kilometer run. And here you actually see the running velocity in meters per second. And you also see this is clearly a slow twitcher, because at the end of the test, he only achieves a lactate concentration just over between 4 and 5 millimoles. So in 1976, they already had data of the best athletes in this paper, and solely for that reason, that paper should be published in English. So, and then also another conceptual advance was that they recommended training in 3 training zones, and that they said there's a zone 1, which is training below the anaerobic threshold, training 2 at the threshold or threshold training, and zone 3 above the threshold. So that was, to my knowledge, the first time that they recommended to base training intensity on lactate concentrations or running velocity or power at a lactate concentration. And so I think in 1970, this Cologne group, or 1976, this Cologne group made several conceptual advances in relation to endurance science. And then after the 1976 papers, a lot of people started to come up with individual thresholds, because the problem was, of course, fixed lactate concentration of 4 millimoles might not represent the individual real threshold. And so there's a good paper by Oliver Faude, Wilfried Kindermann, and Tim Meyer on this in Sports Medicine in 2009 about these thresholds and what threshold concepts existed. And many people in the German-speaking world were doing research on this. But actually, the real individual threshold is, of course, a maximum lactate steady state, abbreviated as MLSS or max LAS. And this is work by Hermann Heck in Cologne. And so what he did is he did a continuous exercise and measured the lactate during that exercise. So this is roughly half an hour. And then he wanted to determine the exercise intensity where the lactate concentration started, or the maximum exercise intensity where the lactate concentration did not rise over time. And that is a max LAS or MLSS. And that is work by Hermann Heck and his colleagues and was published in 1985. So I think just writing a tiny article, a tiny paragraph that the people in Cologne have something in a review about the anaerobic threshold is maybe not enough to say what the Cologne group did. And I think it justifies writing more about it. So to sum up the first part of my talk, what did the Cologne Sports Medicine Group contribute towards anaerobic threshold concepts? The answer is Wilder Heumann discovered in 1959 at least aspects of what Kalman Wasserman later named the anaerobic threshold. But one has to say there were other ideas even earlier, like the Olds point. And so I think sports historians should have a look at this work and then discuss how much this contributed to anaerobic thresholds. In 1959, Heumann presented these findings in Chicago and won a medal for it. So the Americans must have liked it. And I think some people must have been stimulated by his ideas. In 1976, Marder then published this paper on lactate testing in German, and it has several conceptual advances. First, the measurement of lactate in 20 microliters of blood, which he had previously developed with Hase in 1970-1971. The first lactate-based threshold or anaerobic transition at 4 millimoles of lactate, and in 3 lactate-based training zones. And in 1985, then Heck et al. Proposed a maximal lactate steady state as a procedure to validate other lactate thresholds. So the second part of my talk is what is Alois Marder's mathematical model of human exercise metabolism? And this is important work. And modeling human endurance performance has a long history. I mean, this is by Mike Joyner, and is one of the most famous examples for modeling performance, because Mike Joyner modeled in 1991 the optimal marathon performance on the basis of physiological factors. And actually, so he modeled several factors, which was the VO2 max, the VO2 at lactate threshold, and the running economy. And then he modeled here the running speed achievable at low running economy, average running economy, and high economy. And he modeled for the first time that, yeah, if you get all these variables right, you could run a marathon potentially under 2 hours. But now let me calculate. So 1991. So 7 years earlier, actually, Alois Marder did something which surprised virtually everyone. Because what he did is he published a habilitation, which is another thesis which you need in German-speaking countries in order to get the venia legendi to teach as a professor at university. And so he publishes, and this is a theory to calculate the dynamic and the steady state of the phosphorylation state and the metabolic activity of a muscle cell as a result of energy expenditure. And so this was a mathematical model trying to really model human exercise metabolism. And then in 2003, he published a paper which contains no less than 33 equations and complex figures like this. And people really in the field, they really struggle to say, it's no genius or it's just complete madness. And I did for my PhD actually phosphorus NMR at the German aerospace facility. And I was working and I was studying phosphocreatine with a machine, with an NMR machine. And I was really surprised how well the things I was seeing in the NMR machine in relation to phosphocreatine changing during exercise were modeled by Marder's model. So I definitely think it's absolute genius what he did. And especially he did that in 1984. And not only that, then Marder turned his model into a computer simulation. And I think if you really want to appreciate that model, you really need the computer simulation. But let's go back. I mean, he did it in the 1980s. And this is a 1980s computer. Many of you weren't born in the 1980s, but I can tell you, you had these funny floppy disks and yet you stick them in. And then the thing was crashing frequently. And programming was just in its infancy. And Alois Marder managed to put it into the computer and to simulate the response of human energy metabolism of variables like ATP, phosphocreatine, like the glycolytic ATP synthesis, like the oxidative ATP resynthesis, like the lactate concentration in the blood, the oxygen uptake. He managed to produce equations that he could then put into the computer. And then you said, okay, let's simulate exercising 10 minutes at 300 watts, how does my lactate concentration change? How does my VO2 change? And I think it's absolute genius to simply manage to put these equations together and then to simulate human energy metabolism. So how does this model work? Essentially what Mada did is he converted the workload into an ATP hydrolysis rate, because the harder you exercise, the more ATP you consume per unit of time. Then he linked that to equation where he could calculate the concentration of phosphocreatine, ATP, ADP, and AMP. And then he assumed, based on published data, that ADP and AMP were key activators of glycolysis. But importantly also, once glycolysis is active, you produce lactate, the pH drops, and the pH, the dropping pH, is an inhibitor. And so this is the equation he had here. He then used these variables, particularly ADP, not with a Michaelis-Menten kinetic, but with a Hill kinetics, and to simulate oxygen uptake. And then he put all these formulas in a computer. And then what you do is you simply put in the workload in watts. So the data Stephen Seiler has shown at the beginning, you can put them now in a computer, and then the computer, on the basis of all these equations, will then simply say, so this is changing to lactate. These are the changes of lactate. This is what happens to fat oxidation. This happens to oxygen uptake. Even the glycogen concentration you can model today, the changes in the glycogen concentration. And I would like to just demonstrate the function of this model, and this is my last bit now of the talk, by showing that it actually simulates the slow component of the VO2 max. So the slow component is component of the VO2, sorry, it's not the VO2 max, the VO2 is illustrated here by Brian Wibb. And what you see is, so this is a constant load exercise, and here the exercise starts, constant load exercise, and what you see is if VO2 doesn't reach a steady state, but it starts to creep up further. And there's a lot of research that went into simulating and analyzing this VO2 slow component. And so this is a lot of curves, but I'll take you through it. And I would like to show you how Mada's model simulates the slow component of the VO2 during constant load exercise at high intensity. So when you do such exercise, and here it's an exercise from 0 to a bit more than 2 minutes here 3 minutes, so that's a time axis. And so this model, this gray curve here is a curve of ADP that this model produced. And because you increase your ATP turnover or ATP usage, the ADP concentration will increase. The ADP concentration is very low, but it will increase during exercise. And then at the end of the exercise, it will increase quite steeply. So ADP now activates glycolytic ATP resynthesis, the red curve. So this is not the concentration of lactate, but this is how much ATP is produced by glycolysis per unit of time. So this increases. But then actually what happens is at the later stages, even though ADP is increasing further, in the simulation, glycolytic ATP resynthesis starts to decline a little bit. And the reason for that is because once glycolytic ATP resynthesis is active, the muscle is producing lactate and the pH drops. And this is illustrated in this dark gray curve here. This is here the muscle pH, which changes like this. It initially increases a little bit and then it decreases during exercise. And now we have a situation that the decreasing pH is actually inhibiting phosphofructokinase or glycolytic ATP resynthesis. So what you see here is this increase at the beginning is mainly driven by the increase in the ADP concentration. But now at the later stages here, you have a competition. On the one hand, ADP is driving ATP resynthesis by glycolysis. But then the dropping pH, which you see here, is actually inhibiting it. So it's a tug of war between an activator and an inhibitor. And the result of it is in the simulation that glycolytic ATP resynthesis is declining. But now the problem is, of course, it's constant load exercise. And if you assume a constant efficiency, that means that you need to have a constant ATP provision in order to produce all the ATP that you need for your constant load exercise. So because glycolytic ATP resynthesis is declining, now oxidative ATP resynthesis needs to increase over time. And this is a muscular oxidative ATP resynthesis. And if you now look at the whole body situation, what you see is you find there's a slow component, because here VO2 increases during exercise. And here you see the slow component that you measure in your actual experiments. So Marder's model with these formulas simulates actually one of the key observations by Brian Wibb and Carmen Wasserman, which is a slow component during high intensity, constant load exercise. And the second curve is here, the blood lactate concentration. So if all of this is true, then what you would expect is that the lactate doesn't increase linearly, because linear increase means that the glycolytic ATP resynthesis is constant and does not decline as simulated in Marder's model, but that you find such a time course here of the glycolytic ATP resynthesis. So just to sum up, Marder's model simulates a really complex phenomenon of exercise physiology where many people have done research about. And I know Andy Jones and others explained that that efficiency is changing. This is not modeled in this, that the slow component is explained by a worsening efficiency of the exercise. This might well happen, but Marder's model on a metabolic explanation models actually the slow component of the VO2. Okay, and so what is Marder's mathematical model of human exercise metabolism? So I think it is really, in 1984, it was well ahead of its time that he managed to put all these formulas together to even be able to model that. And this model turns metabolism from a black box into a mechanistic model that makes testable predictions. And now you might ask, for what is this actually useful? So I think Marder's model is useful for mechanistic teaching of human exercise metabolism. So I use it to teach my students how exercise functions and how these things are interrelated, that then enable you to give an endurance performance. It also identifies possible potential causes for metabolic phenomena, such as a slow component of the VO2 max. It identifies the Vila max, which is a topic of Sebastian Weber, as an important endurance variable. And it also suggests a mechanism for the regulation of fat oxidation that is consistent with Lundsgaard et al., which I have published in Trends of Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2018. And actually, as a practitioner, what you can do is you can say, okay, I want to achieve this performance, and you can use Marder's model to understand the metabolism you need to achieve that performance. So now just one thing, Hermann Heck, together with Ulrich Bartmus and Volker Grabo, right at the end now, have published a book on lactate. It's 662 pages. It covers essentially what I've showed you about the 1976 paper, the Max Lass, and also Alois Marder's model. And unfortunately, this is published in German. And I really said, Hermann, you can't do that. This book really needs to be published also in English. So, and I would appreciate it if you could also convince Springer to publish this book into English, because this is 662 pages on lactate performance testing and actually data. And it would be terrible if these data wouldn't be accessible to the English-speaking world. And so I'd like to finish with my acknowledgement. So this is Hermann Heck. We were last week in Cologne. Hermann gave us his book, and we had a bit of a party because Hermann supported us. I would like to thank all the other people who've contributed to our article here. This was a lot of work, and especially to Hermann Heck, because he gave us a lot of essential data. And I would like to thank our funders to fund our endurance research. So we have two people in the team who really focus only on endurance research. One is Daniel Appelhans, who also studied in Cologne, and one is Melanie Knopp. She is an American, German-American. She works with East African runners, and she studied the masters here. I would like to thank the Bundesinstitut für Sportwissenschaft for funding our research, the Deutsche Skiverband for a great collaboration, and then also the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. And thank you very much for your time, and apologies if I ran a little bit over time.
Okay, thank you very much, Henning, for this interesting talk on history and lactate. So I think we only have short time for one question, so I just bring one question together several questions. So what is the accuracy of this simulation, and what is the limitation of the simulation?
So if I have 2 hours, I could discuss all that. I think, I mean, the model is available and the computer simulation is available. And I mean, to me, it is all pretty convincing. I mean, there are some issues with the simulation, and I think the best thing is if people have access to the simulation, if they do actual exercise tests and then compare it to the simulation, and then they can really see, so how well does it predict phenomena that you see in reality? And I think Sebastian Weber will come in his talk to the simulation, because Sebastian Weber is also a student of Alois Mader, and he can comment maybe more about it.
Okay, thank you very much, Henning. And now it's time to come to our last speaker, Sebastian Weber, and Henning started the introduction to Sebastian. So just some words to him personally. So Sebastian borrowed in 2002 an SRM ergometer from Hermann Hecke. And with this ergometer, he developed a new method on 15-second sprint testing at the German University of Cologne. In the following years, he focused on the adaptation and the development of new methods using VO2 and the VLA-Max. Furthermore, he worked together with Sebastian Gehler on muscular markers and has done a lot of research on aerobic as well as glycolytic metabolism in these muscles, and have done there tons of different kind of muscle biopsies. Based on this research, he developed the concept of the VLA-Max, and with this method, he was quite successful in collaboration with elite cycling athletes. So, and yeah, I think we will see some interesting data today from famous cyclists like Peter Sagan or Ivan Basso or André Greipel. But now let us dive into the lactate analysis. So it's directly in connection to Henning's talk, and I will give over to Sebastian.
Yes, thank you, Martin. Hope you guys can hear me well. Can you give me a thumbs up for that, maybe, if that works? And then I'm going to share my screen here. And just on a technical level, Martin, can you give me confirmation if you can see my screen?
Everything fine.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, well, that was, thank you very much. It was a good intro, especially also from Henning. Some of the stuff, yeah, great talk, and especially to Henning. Many, many thanks for organizing this symposium and for inviting me. I really liked all the presentations I heard so far, and trying to even get close to that, hopefully. One thing to comment on Henning, which I feel like is also under appreciated maybe, is what you mentioned about the ability to measure lactate in the capillary blood that Alois developed together with Hase. What many people don't know, that actually he gave this technology to Eppendorf in Hamburg, and they implemented into basically the way how most people since then measure lactate. So when anybody of you measures lactate, with the mobile device or with an app device, it's very likely that what you're doing goes back to the work of Alois, again, who just handed it basically over to Eppendorf. So enough about that. I'm going to start to, with my presentation, which is on VLA-Max, or maybe better to be, or also be described as a marker or a proxy for glycolytic power. And I'm trying to focus a little bit on why does it matter and how can it be measured, or what are restrictions to actually measuring it. And with that, I would like to give you a little bit of an overview why I'm talking about this topic. Martin already explained a little bit about my background. And as you might have noticed, my image here didn't have a university next to it. So I'm actually not working for university, but I'm involved in a commercial software project, which I'm going to explain now in a second here. So some personal history of utilizing VLMX. I came across in some literatures, I guess it was in the 19th, Hermann might correct me, about VLMX, where it was postulated that more or less translating like it should be possible to estimate VLMX using a short sprint test. And I'm going to come back to that. And that caught my interest, mainly because I was working in the sport university in Cologne. Funny side effect, I was actually working in the very office Alois was working on before he left. So I basically took his desk and started to work there. And as Martin already explained, I then borrowed an ergometer from Hermann to try to apply this equation. So this equation here is basically what was linked to that statement, how it should be possible to estimate VLMX. And I'm really pronouncing it this way because it has the words possible and should be possible and estimate. And it was not postulated as, hey, here's an accurate way how people can measure VLMX. Huh? So I borrowed this ergometer, and this is a picture of this very ergometer. As you can tell, even by standards back then, no offense, it was pretty old. And by standards now, it was really old. You can see these little wooden shims next to the stem that were used because otherwise the handlebar was moving, and it was really good. It was really reliable. We used it for several years, but there are some technical restrictions that I'm going to come back to. So that was 2002. So I borrowed an ergometer, and what many people don't know is that there was a lot of testing. We tested the German national track sprint team, obviously sports students, and some professional recreational cyclists and triathletes to develop a methodology on how to test VLMX using this short sprint test as postulated in the literature. And then I described that methodology in very details, but without all the data in my diploma thesis, without all the data, because the diploma thesis was actually about something else. It was actually about using a stripped down, mathematically simplified model of Alois and then basically feed the VLMX, but the complete methodology with all the data of the VLMX was not in there, just because otherwise it would have blown up the already 200 pages. And then in 2003 and 2007, as Martin indicated, I pivoted towards studies and research about adaptation, which basically was the desire from the subject of the athlete. So what happened was the athletes did have the VLMX measured and other stuff like VO2 max and get some simulated or calculated results, and they were asking, how do we change it? So there was a lot of interest, to be able to understand how these parameters change by training. So we organized training studies, four of those with 12 subjects each time approximately. And then basically I left university, and as Martin showed, utilized all these findings in pro cycling teams, coaching pro cycling teams. And then what I just said, where I'm coming from, or in what position I'm standing here, is that in 2014, I had contact again with Alois, and we basically partnered and to create a software for his computer models, specifically also because his last publication was this big publication, this big paper that Henning just mentioned in 2003, but there were a lot of further development beyond this 2003 paper. So there were stuff that was not even not published, but it was from a computer science perspective, it was not even finished. And the idea was then to take that and make it applicable and validate it and develop it in a way that it can be applicable in practical application, because that's obviously, as you can tell in my background, more is like the practical application. So since then, we work together in this project. Is what I'm here for today, or where I'm coming from, is in a software called Insight. And this picture was actually taken on the way to one week coding together. Okay, so that's my background. Now let's focus on the main topic. Why does it matter? Why do at least I think people should take a look at something like VLMX, and why should you care? Well, here's an illustration about the glycolysis starting with either glycogen or glucose, thanks to Florian, who was also listening in here for creating this great visualization. Basically, glycolysis is obviously one of the three systems the muscle has to create ATP, or if you want to simplify, energy for muscular work. Depending on what source, it's approximately 3 or 2 ATP per glucose, or 1 to 1.5 per lactate. It's important, it's trainable. There's tons of studies out there that shows adaptations, to the glycolytic system up and down. Some of them are related to muscle fiber shifts, which I will come back to, right? So I will show some data also related to muscle fibers based on these studies I just mentioned in Cologne. And from a practical point of view, why you want to care about that is because in most, sort of unique, maybe not in marathon, but in most or many competitive events, the moments that actually decide the outcome of a race often require a certain amount of anaerobic energy. And therefore, it might be worth looking at anaerobic metabolism. And what is maybe not so obvious, but many thanks to what Henning has shown, is the lab test of Merck's, actually not the Merck's lab test, but the 1976 paper. It also affects endurance performance and substrate utilization, and that's something I'm going to show today. So to start with, to get some common ground here, what are common values? So when you talk about VLMX on the blood level, not on a muscular level, low values are somewhere in the ballpark of 0.3 millimoles per liter per second, right? So it's the flux rate. That's where the term VLA comes also from, or right? We could relate it maybe to Vmax, like in enzyme kinetics. So 0.3 is approximately the, in the lower range, sometimes 0.2, in that range. And obviously, and this is why I listed here, there's a certain amount of power that comes with it, right? So again, if we say there's 1 to 1.5 ATP per lactate, then that means if you assume, which is probably correct, a constant rate of ATP versus power production, talking about this efficiency thing, then there's a direct link between lactate accumulated and power produced. And this is also what is described in several articles, not even dealing with VLMX. Then your non-perfect endurance athletes, mid-range athletes, average, so to speak, are more in the ballpark of 0.5, maybe 0.6. That is like, mid-range kind of stuff. It would be like middle distance runners, that area. And then pure sprinters, you go up to approximately 1.0. Right, so cycling sprinters and road cycling a little bit below, track and field sprinters, like real sprinters, in the ballpark of 1.0. Otherwise, it's impossible to run those speeds and create those power outputs that you can see in these athletes. So just to create some common grounds here. And I want to start where Henning left a little bit, giving a practical implication. Again, that's where I'm coming from, 10 years of professional road cycling. Giving some practical implication how this can be used in combination, or demonstrating the importance, demonstrating the importance of glycolytic energy flux in sports. Here's an example of the final stage of the Tour de France. The guy in white here is André Greipel. We had all the metabolic profile data from him, and he was so kind to share his power profile of that particular race. So this is the final stage where he led Peter Sagan to the second place in the 2016 Tour de France. And again, this is the metabolic profile of Andre, and this body composition, everything needed. And then the race file, we were doing some computer simulations, and I'm just showing a simplified view. This is the power output of the last 2 minutes, and you can see this high fluctuations. It's a little bit similar to what Stephen referred to in his first presentation today. You have these high fluctuations, very, very short. Because those fluctuations are relatively short, what happens is it drives creatine phosphate down. I mean, each time, right, a lot of this energy has to be covered by using creatine phosphate as energy source. And then with that, similar as Henning already showed, it will drive up oxidative phosphorylation, so it will drive up aerobic metabolism. And then here, when it comes around the final corner, this dip here at almost 2 hours 50 is the final corner, and then that's here, and then this is the acceleration out of the corner, and this is where he starts the sprint and goes out of his drafting position. At this time, his peak power is 1600 watts, and because of what I just explained, or what Henning showed, of all the breakdown of creatine phosphate, of the high intensity before that, at this point in time, approximately 500 watts of his power is coming from aerobic metabolism, because this is how high his VO2 is, right? It's almost maxed out. And then again, because creatine phosphate is already so much depleted, there's only so much that can be covered by breakdown of creatine phosphate even further, even though it's a sprint. But remember, it's a sprint after several hours of racing, right? And then, which leaves approximately 950 watts to be covered by glycolysis. Other than that, give or take 50 watts whatsoever, doesn't matter. Give or take, other than that, this sprint power is not possible. So there's one direct practical implication why you want to care about VLMX. Now I'm shifting it a little bit from the obvious, anaerobic energy is important for short-term events, shifting it a little bit to practical application. What does it do about endurance performance? Which is maybe not so obvious to see. Here's one example. This is actually from my thesis back in the day, where we're looking at the percentage utilization of VO2 max. So how much at maximum lactate steady state. So at which percentage of VO2 max is the maximum lactate steady state, correlated to the VLMX on the x-axis. So you can see that there's a quite nice relationship between how high or how low the VLMX is and how much somebody can actually use of his or her. In this case, it was only his, it was only males, but there have been consecutive studies with females and running and so on and so on a couple of years afterwards. So you can see there's a very nice relationship. And I don't want to disappoint Henning here, who said I'm going to show some data. So I actually looked in my old hard disk drive to prepare for this presentation today and found some lactate profile tests. In 2007, we would still do lactate profile tests like step tests. We then stopped that quite quickly. But in this time, we would still do step tests. And luckily, I found 2 step tests of 2 cyclists, which were more or less exactly the same. So by half a kilogram, same body weight, similar body composition, by 50 milliliters total, by absolutes, the same VO2 max. And then we basically did this in a step test, and we did the VLMX test. I'm going to explain a little bit within whatever 2-3 days approximately. And you can see these 2 athletes here: black solid line versus gray dashed line. And you can see there's a very significant right shift, what people call of the lactate profile curve, which is accounting for, doesn't matter which lactate concentration you want to use. If you look at the gap, it's approximately 50 watts in what you might consider a threshold or a maximum lactate steady state value, right? If you look at 2 millimoles, 3, 4, you're always talking about, 50 watts approximately, 45 watts something of difference. And looking at the VLMX of these athletes, this was really, besides half a kilogram give or take the body weight, this was really the main differentiator between those 2 athletes, right? The black solid line has a VLMX of 0.85, and the gray dotted line or dashed line showed a VLMX of 0.49. So significant difference, and that is very similar to what also is in this paper Henning just mentioned in Frontiers of Physiology, I guess it was. Okay, and how can we explain that? And this is why I'm so thankful for Henning's talk here. He showed this right shift in the 1976 paper. And if you might have noticed, there's a right shift in lactate, but there's also a slight increase, a very, very slight increase in VO2. And that's easily to explain if you look into the calculations or simulations. So this is here what you see, the lactate production now, so not the concentration, but the lactate production of these two athletes in red, and the maximum possible lactate combustion in the aerobic metabolism. So, right, so remember, as for example shown by Brooks, the amount of lactate you can combust is a function of the oxygen uptake. I mean, it should be quite obvious that in this universe, if you're going to oxidize anything, you need oxygen for it. The more oxygen you have, the more you can oxidize. So you can see here also the same effect, right? The dashed one is again athlete 2. So you can see athlete 2 shows a slightly elevated aerobic energy contribution, right? Because the glycolytic system is a little bit weaker, and he produces significant less lactate, right? This is why at the same combustion he has lower concentration, and this is why also then the curve is what you see here shifted to the right. And this is because, simplified speaking, because this VLMX is lower, right? So similar to what Henning said, there's a war here, so to see that there's a competition. That's the simplified way how you could view it, is that in athlete number 1, the glycolytic system is so much stronger, so much bigger, there's so much more energy that can come from it. You could also see, and I will come back to that, there's most likely different fiber type distribution, right? So those fast twitch fibers will get recruited earlier, therefore leading to earlier in terms of lower power outputs, therefore leading to more lactate production, and so to speak, lower power outputs. Okay, and this is exactly what I want to show now. As mentioned, together with Sebastian Gerlach and Gilbert Plath, and Sebastian, and he's here on the call. We did a lot of muscle biopsies back in the days. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff is not yet published. That might change, however, in the near future. And I brought today just a little snapshot. There's quite more, but I promised some other data to Oliver Klittmann for his symposium in March. So there's more to come. For this presentation, I looked at one part of this 4 years project, and looked at the VLMX on the y-axis versus the sum of percentage of 2B and 2X fibers. Well, actually, in this case, it was called 2C. But so you understand basically fast twitch glycolytic and the very fast fibers, which in many subjects were not even measurable. So this was by normal ATPase staining, and you can see that there is some correlation, as you could have expected, maybe, between the VLMX, so the maximum lactate rate in the blood, and the content of fast glycolytic fibers, in this case, typical of the vascular laterals. Okay. So with that, hopefully I could convince you that it can be interesting to look at VLMX. So then there comes the question, how to measure it, or maybe how not to measure it. Because there are many pitfalls and shortcomings. I started with that, introduction about the quote from the 90s that a sprint test could estimate it. So going back to this borrowed ergometer, here it is again. I'm not sure if that even exists still, would be interesting to know. So starting with that again, why should it even work? So why should it even be possible to use blood lactate to estimate glycolytic ATP production? Well, one is because, again, there's a ratio between how much lactate is produced and how much ATP is produced, which is depending on if you start with glycogen, with glucose 1 to 1, 1 to 1.5. In my 2002 work, I came up with a 15 seconds all-out sprint on a cyclic ergometer, which was pretty specific. And I'm going to show you the protocol in a second, which was pretty specific. For example, it has to be seated to really standardize the amount of muscle mass involved. You can see here in the picture, this is a junior sprinter from that time, German track sprinting team. And there were some other specific aerometer settings which kind of got lost, so to speak, or people don't really pay attention to it. But I'm going to explain why that is a problem. Then later on, after this collaboration with Alois, we started to calculate VLMX using sub-maximum efforts. And actually, one thing that looks really, really reliable is to calculate, also involving the energy flux, to kind of building in a validation where we not only look at the lactate, but also how much glycolytic power was there. And I'm going to show an example from the literature in this case. And here it is. So I looked at this, or brought the study of Bogdanis today, primarily for one reason, and that is because there have been some critics about the concept of VLMX, which are based on the statement that blood lactate is independent of VLMX in the muscle, and that all the work of Alois, only would come from cellular level, from muscular level, and therefore whatever you do in the blood has nothing to do with it. But simplified speaking, right? But on the one hand, everything that you measure in the blood more or less comes from cells in one way or the other. So there has to be a connection. And in this beautiful paper from Bogdanis here from 1906, it's very nicely possible to make this connection. So what they did here, they did 30-second Wingate sprint test, so very standard test, you could say, okay? And they measured lactate in the muscle and in the blood. And therefore, it's so nice to compare those two. And they used it, similar as you would do with VLMX, to come up with a measure or with a figure for glycolytic ATP or ATP turnover, which was then, obviously equal to glycolytic power, because ATP over time is similar to energy over time, giving this certain efficiency. So what they found here is we need to keep this number in mind. 159, 160, for glycolytic ATP turnover. And they were giving the figures in dry muscle in dry weight of muscle. You have to remember that. So therefore, they had a resting lactate concentration of 5.8, which makes sense if you assume 75–80% water content in the muscle. And at the end of the 30-second sprint test, they had 108 millimoles. Okay, so there's a delta. There's a delta of 102, and I'm taking this delta because I've already shown this equation, right? The standard equation for a sprint test, you basically take delta lactate and divide it by the delta time, right? This is what many people do these days to get the, at least try to measure VLMX, so to speak. Okay, so how can we now use this 102 millimoles per kilogram dry weight and translate it and kind of refer it to what VLMX would then be? Okay, now that's something that is possible if you look at the different compartments, right? So the lactate is produced in the muscle, and then it dilutes in what we would call a lactate distribution or lactate dilution space, which is a function of the body water, right? So lactate can only be found in body water, but supposedly it's not found, with the same distribution in all body waters. So according to the literature, there's a certain percentage in which it dilutes as a function of the body water. And if you take this into account, there's obviously the kilograms of the athletes or the subjects in the paper. If you account for that, then you end up that this delta of 102 millimoles lactate in dry muscle weight would be approximately, they didn't give the starting value of lactate and so on, but approximately, there's no precise body composition, but would be approximately 11.3 something, give or take, lactate in blood. But what they did do, they gave an approximation of what they measured. As you can see here, so immediately after the exercise, as you would expect, lactate was lower, it was in this case 9. But then if you wait long enough and measure post-exercise lactate concentration, is what we normally do is performance testing and practical application, it would rise to 12 millimoles. And that's very close to the 11.3 you can just calculate from the dry muscle mass. And therefore, it's absolutely clear and no surprise that if you then translate this 11.3. Using this equation with lactate build-up time, it would come out as a VLMX of 0.45. So first thing, not really surprising if you consider that it's a really average value, similar to what we found in sports students. And then if you translate that back again using an estimated body composition, you get to an approximately 1.22 millimoles per kilogram of ATP flux per dry muscle weight, and that would then calculate to 158. And that is again very, very close to what they described in the study. So long story short, of course, the blood lactate concentrations that we measure basically derives from the lactate primarily in the muscle, right? That's, by the way, the same for oxygen uptake measurements, right? Why we do that is because we assume that during exercise, most of the oxygen is consumed in the muscle cells. So there's a direct link, and you can even quantitatively make a direct link between lactate concentrations and delta lactate and lactate flux in the muscle to blood, and also even calculate from blood lactate what's shown here in the lower part, calculate from blood lactate what would be the ATP flux of glycolysis in the muscle. So therefore the question is, does it now mean that we can just do any kind of sprint test using this equation here again and get a valid, usable, accurate VLMX? And this is unfortunately not that easy. One thing to consider is the time, obviously. And as I mentioned, I guess the original 2002 protocol had like a 15-second sprint test. And there's a good justification for that, because there's some other studies like this one from Walter et al. From 1999, Journal of Applied Physiology, looking at glycolytic flux. And as you can see that, and there's other studies again from Wingate tests and so on and so forth that show exactly the same thing. After approximately, give or take 15 seconds, give or take 2 seconds plus minus, the maximum glycolytic flux rate, is declining. Because of what just Henning explained, it's very sensitive to decreases in pH values. And at that time, can also be seen in the simulation, pH is already low, therefore glycolytic energy flux is inhibited, and therefore time is much longer than that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Don't really make a lot of sense here. And this then led to this protocol, the 2002 protocol, which I would like to explain really quick. I already mentioned that there will be many details. So the idea was, sorry, it's in German, but I thought I'd take the original scan from the Caesars. There was a warm-up, and then there was a resting period. And the resting period was really there. People were sitting on a chair. So we always have the ergometer and the chair next to it. People were sitting on a chair to ensure creatine phosphate is up again, VO2 is down again, so that it really comes from resting levels. And then there would be a sprint. We changed to 3 pre-effort values. Here's only shown 1, but we changed to 3. I'm going to show in my last slide why that is very important. And then basically measure lactate all the time afterwards. Okay? And then looking at this delta lactate, just as we did in the Bob study. And here's an example of that curve. So the blue one would be the power output. The blue one is the cadence, so the RPM. The green one is power output. And then if you apply that formula, one thing, for example, that overlap is the question, when does the time end? At that time, I define basically the time of the sprint ends when the power drops below the power that equals VO2 max power. And now there was a question for the alactate time, which is whoever is listening and is doing these kind of sprint tests, you will be familiar with that. My definition, which more or less fortunately has been reused or copied, is a non-reversible reduction of power by 3.5%. Like from the start to this non-reversible reduction of power by 3.5%, this is what I declare the alactate time. There's a good reason for that, because if you look at this moment and the power declines, like, don't want to go too much into a rabbit hole, but it would mean that there is a significant degree of reduced creatine phosphate, which is then resulting in lower force, which then results in lower power, and so on and so forth. So this is why a reduction in power in general should be a good indicator for the onset of a high glycolytic flux. And then we have this 3.5%, which nowadays seem to fall from the sky. It's not the case. Actually, I had this SRM ergometer. We kind of make like a running gag in this presentation today from Hermann. And at that time, it had these old Dura-Ace cranks, which were cut off by Uli, and the power meter was screwed on there. And the power meter only had 4 strain gauges. And 4 strain gauges give an accuracy of approximately 2.5%. So basically, remember, I called up my friend Uli and said, look, Uli, what's the accuracy of that? He said, yeah, 2.5%. So I said, okay, then I give 1% more, right? I could have given 0.1 or 0.01% more. I give 1% more and say, if I see the drop in power being 1% more than the accuracy of the power meter, this is what I declare as a real significant drop in power. Now, that means if you use it as a power meter, these days there's 20 strain gauges in an SM ergometer, you should not stick to 3.5%, right? So this is where this comes from. But there were more to it, because I mentioned I used this ergometer from Hermann, borrowed it, and about 10 months developed this methodology. And these 10 months, Hermann might remember, went into looking at standing versus seated. What is the right gearing? What is the right cadence? All these things, like how does it change with gender, with athlete type, all these different things. That is really important. That is all described in this 2003 thing. So basically what we derived was a specific setting for the ergometer, how it needs to be set up in order to create what we thought at this time would be a valid test. Because think about it this way, compared to a VO2 max REM test. If you do a REM test, you want to measure VO2 max. There, you have the comfortable situation that you ramp up the intensity until exhaustion, which means before the start of the test, you don't need to know what is intensity that will elicit, fatigue or result in exhaustion. And here it's different. You need to set up the ergometer in a way that before the athlete starts the exercise or starts the test, you know what is, for example, the cadence, right? There's a relationship between best cadence and maximum power output. You need to know what is the cadence I can use that enable my athlete to reach maximum power. What is the gearing? Like how big, how small can the gear be to enable my athlete to reach maximum power? Because obviously, if that's not the case, like if the athlete was not able to reach maximum power, then you cannot assume that you measured something maximum, especially not maximum glycolytic energy flux. Okay, so this would go in here, and I'd like to explain why that is so important. Okay, because this brings us to the pitfalls and shortcomings and something I would really emphasize and encourage you, recommend you to pay attention to if you want to do these kind of testing. You need to enable the athlete to reach maximum power. It goes back to the ergometer setting and becomes an even bigger issue if you look at something in running or other sports. One thing that is overlooked here, that is simplified in this situation, lactate production does not end immediately at the end of the sprint. You would not expect this from any biological system like this, basically goes to zero. It has a little bit of an offset kinetics. Much faster than VO2, of course, but there is some kind of offset kinetics. So this is not reflected in the total time. One of the biggest problems is, however, that what this equation does, it basically looks at the delta lactate. If you would look at the curve like Henning showed with the lactate flux, you would basically look at the area below the curve. So you look at the total amount of lactate that's produced in muscle, and this goes into the bloodstream, is diluted in the water space. And so what you essentially are actually measuring here is the average flux and not the maximum. So you could have this peak, similar you have a peak in the power, and this is then should be then the VLA max. And what you actually measure is more or less the average over 10, 12 seconds whatsoever. And the most important one, what has puzzled people the most, is this alactic time. And this is per se a nice concept, but unfortunately it's a flawed concept. Because it should be quite obvious that glycolysis isn't regulated as a function of time, right? If I now go to the coffee machine and get myself a coffee, then, you know, when does glycolysis set in? Or if you look at different sporting events, Viral League's marathon running, where there's a 100-meter sprint, when does glycolysis set in? It's not a function of time. But this equation does show it as it would be a function of time. And it only works being a function of time if everything else is correct. If you set up your test in a way that allows the athlete to reach maximum power output. Okay? And so I want to show this galactic time. This is a visualization from a great guy doing currently a research project in the Netherlands, exactly on this topic, on the methodologies on VLMX tests. And here what you see is 3 different settings, in this case on the Cyclus 2 algometer. So you see the power output versus the time. Time is on the x-axis, power is on the y-axis. Okay? And you see these 3 different settings. And now look, please look for this decline, this non-reversible decline in power output. With the gray settings, it happens after approximately 1 second. This is the same athlete, huh? Don't forget, this is the same athlete. If we change the setting of the ergometer, the decline is not after 1 second, but maybe after 3. And then another setting, you can even see there's 2 spikes, and the non-reversible one, it would be after 6 seconds. So it totally changes how you set up your ergometer. And this creates many problems in a practical application. I will come back to the error that it creates. But in general, what it does, if you set up one ergometer, and I stick to cycling, I could use running or other examples, but I stick to cycling. If you set up your ergometer and you look at the power curves, and let's paint it a little bit black and white here. Let's take a sprinter guy and an endurance guy. Sprinter guy, here's the blue one. What would happen with the blue one? The sprinter guy would be able to accelerate to a high power very, very quick because he's very explosive, right? And then maybe, for example, runs out of gears, runs out of cadence, past maximum optimal cadence, and then the power declines. So then his lactic time would start here. While the endurance guy, because he's not so explosive, takes so long time to ramp up, you know, to come to the maximum power, maybe not even reaching maximum power. And because it takes so long, now his lactic time becomes much longer. And now what happens to what you get, it's a paradox. So the sprinter now has a short lactic time, but remember, the lactic time sits in the denominator. So therefore, the sprinter gets calculated at a low VLA max, and the endurance type guy, because his lactic time is far too long, so to speak, because he's not able to accelerate it, his calculated lactic time gets much longer, the denominator gets smaller, therefore he gets a higher VLA max. So what happens is, unfortunately with this kind of testing, you tend to overestimate the VLA max of your endurance guys and to underestimate the VLA max of your sprinters. This is what happens if you just do any kind of sprint test, you know, just putting people on an ergometer, or let's do a 100-meter sprint on the run or something. If you don't account for that, this is what happens if you just use this equation easily. And from experience, I've seen that happen quite some time. So it's not perfect. It's not that straightforward just to do a sprint. And it's very simple. You don't need anything else, just some calculations to find out how sensitive, that's important, right? How sensitive is this calculation of VLA max to these kind of things? And that's my last slide I would like to walk you through. What you see here is one example. The test case has a resting lactate concentration of 1.5, a maximum lactate concentration of 10, and a lactic time of 3 seconds. This would be here. This would be 0% deviation of VLA max on the x-axis, and no error in lactic time on the right y-axis, and no error on lactate measurements on the left y-axis. Okay, so now what you can see here is, let's for example look at maximum lactate concentration. That would be quite obvious, right? What you would expect, somebody reaches higher lactate concentrations in a sprint of 15 seconds, and therefore you say, hey, he's got a higher VLA max. Look how this changes. So if somebody, for example, has, in this case, 2 millimoles higher maximum lactate measure, which is, by the way, easily what you could measure with, for example, 2 different handheld devices, right? 2 millimoles delta in lactate create almost 20% error in the VLA max in this case, in this particular case, okay? The time and resting lactate concentration, I mentioned before, you might remember, I said, normally you do 3 resting values before the sprint. This here, the red one is the error of the pre-values, right? 0.5 error in pre-resting value buys you approximately 5% error in the, creates approximately 5% error in the calculated VLA max. And one of the biggest problems, obviously, is the green one, alactic time. Alactic time here, you can read it 3 seconds, right? This is the standard, this is this green triangle. And now, if it just happens what I just described, because of the gearing of the ergometer, if it's becoming a little bit shorter, a little bit longer than alactic time, because we overgeared or undergeared, as an example. The alactic time, let's say it goes from 3 seconds to 5 seconds. It buys you an error again of almost 20%. Calculated the standard errors here, lactate resting, the deviation of delta of 1 millimole buys you an error of almost 12%. Maximum buys you an error of measurement is the maximum lactate, it's an error of approximately 8.5% for each millimole. And for each second, you can easily have 2-3 seconds off. For each second of the alactic time, you get also 8.3% error in the VLA max. So takeaway message is just doing any kind of sprint test does give you any kind of VLA max, right? Because it was from the very beginning an idea to estimate approximately VLA max. And with that, I think Martin took my screen, so I cannot show and thank everybody who contributed. With that, I would like to end my presentation and give especially a warm thanks to Alois and wish him all the best because he is sick since the beginning of the week. So, get well soon and all the best to you. Thanks a lot.
Also, thanks a lot from my side, but I did not skip.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Then no. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this nice talk. We have many questions in the chat, and I will give a try to bring the questions to you, so in a logical order. So first of all, is the VLA max in swimming, cycling, and running the same in most triathletes, or can we expect a large difference between disciplines?
I would not say that I do have enough experience nor data to answer this question, particular in swimming and triathletes. But because there are already significant differences in running, I mean, not huge, not like 200%, but because there are differences in running and cycling, and then taking into account that in swimming you use entirely different muscles from the upper body, which hopefully you didn't use in cycling, I would assume that there are some significant differences, yes.
Okay, further question from Matthias Verstelen. In the comparison of both pro cyclists you have done, could you detect VLA differences with just combining gas exchange with lactate samples?
Depends on how you do it. I would say without the power output and without the body composition, I would not be happy in terms of the accuracy when you do that. In between 2006 and 2014, I had my own human performance lab, and we did it in running, where we looked at the VO2 anaerobic threshold and the VO2 max. similar to this percentage utilization, and calculate VLMX from that. So, avoid doing a sprint test in the laboratory on the treadmill. So theoretically that's possible, or let's say mathematically that's possible. The problem is that the error sensitivity is not very good. So the error sensitivity, for example, on the VO2 max is approximately 1 to 5 to 1 to 6. So that means if you have a common 2.5% error in your VO2 max, which is best guess, especially in running, right? It's easily higher. That already buys you 12.5%, inaccuracy in VLMX. So therefore, I would not really recommend doing it this way, if this is what was implied as a question.
Okay, also a question to the two cyclists from Peter Reinders. In the comparison of the two cyclists, one could also say that the rider 1 has a better aerobic threshold than the rider 2, better trained or more type 1 fibers, etc. How can one be sure that this can be attributed to some whole body VLAMAX or fixed metric data?
Excellent question. So yes, definitely whatever we would describe as the undefined aerobic threshold in this case here, right? There would be the athlete would have a better aerobic threshold. That's true, but this is not a cause, but this is an effect of what we just described, right? That basically my aerobic threshold in terms of earlier or later onset or change in onset of lactate concentration. Yes, that's definitely the case, and that is indeed what I tried to explain, linked to let's call it earlier or lower power output lactate production by the athlete with the higher VLMX. And as I showed afterwards, there's also a correlation between the VLMX and the fast twitch fiber contribution. So yes, this is all linked together, right? You cannot separate one from the other.
Okay, further question without a name. So what is the difference between VLAMAX and W, so power? Of course, one uses lactate data and the other power data. Would an athlete with a high VLAMAX also have a high power or vice versa?
Power means W prime?
Yeah.
Yes. W prime and VLMX are it's totally different. So one is VLMX is an energy flux, right? It's using lactate as a proxy for glycolytic energy flux. So it is energy over time, which is basically the definition of power. While W prime is energy, right? So there's no time component in it. That's also how it's calculated. So there's two differences, or one difference already. The main difference, however, is that the majority of the W prime, the majority of energy is aerobic. It's not anaerobic at all. It's something that was positive in the very beginning when it was called anaerobic reserve capacity or something like that. But even now, guys like Phil Stieber who work on that, acknowledge today that it's not anaerobic energy. And if you think about it, think about an incremental test. Think about the power output at which you have critical power or maximum steady state or metabolic steady state whatsoever. Okay, so let's say your power or critical power, and then up to when you reach VO2 max. If you just calculate the delta power, if you calculate the delta VO2 from this point, right? So how much more VO2 you take up over critical power, that accounts for, depending on the duration, 90 to 95% of W prime. W prime is primarily aerobic.
Okay, I think we can have one last question, and the other questions I have read here are too long to explain. So I would say that you will address this directly to Sebastian. And the last question is also from Pierre Hausemer. From body composition measurements, since we know that on an individual level, it's not really possible to measure muscle mass or percent of body fat precisely. Like there is always an error of 2 to 3% according to his knowledge. Do you see this as a concern, assuming that the model needs muscle mass or fat mass measurement?
Yeah, excellent question again. Thanks, Pete. So what is important to look similar what I just did with this very simple equation of the VLA max, right? It's just as a numerator, denominator, but also with more complex models. I think what is important to look at is the error sensitivity. So yes, it's absolutely true. You know, it's impossible to be sure about the body composition that you measure. The question, however, is how big is the effect on on the values that you are interested in when you use this body composition metric for the calculations. And this error sensitivity is relatively low. So what is important is to be able to understand, is my athlete more 10% body fat or more 20%, and therefore has more 68% water or more 62% water. But it's not really important to understand if it's 10% or 12 or 8. Like there, the differences on most metrics are so small that it doesn't really matter. At least not for a practical application.
Okay, thank you very much for answering this last question. So if I look on my watch, we are a little bit over the time, but looking on the participants, there are still more than 200 participants in the meeting. So first of all, I want to thank from my side to all of the speakers for these interesting talks. And in the end, I had the pleasure to round a little bit up all these 4 interesting talks. And I think we can make one total symposium on each of the talks. And in the end, we have seen in all of the 4 talks that high intensity exercise or high intensity performance is a factor for endurance capacity. And in many cases, we have seen these alternating intensities. We see this in cross-country skiers. We see this at the marathon runners as well. We see this in the cyclists. From my point of view, is if this is an element which is responsible for or the capacity to compete with these high intensities and resting phases, if this is a limiting factor nowadays in high performance athletes, my question is, do we have any predictor of these of the capacity to recover in these short phases where we have not this high intensity? Is it only the VO2 max which is a determinator of the recovery, or do we have other factors we have to measure? And maybe this leads later on how we can train this capacity. If any of the speakers has an answer on this question. I see Stephen.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that I think, you know, we still are encumbered by the realities of there are a lot of different cellular adaptations regarding, you know, the movement of ions across. So we have various transporters. We have the MCT1, MCT4. We have a lot of different, you know, there's a lot of molecular biology going on that we are aggregating into some type of systemic level measurement that we're able to make. So I do think that we have to be humble in that reality that I'm not, you know, I don't feel comfortable yet with all of this. I find myself on the very thin ice trying to understand the details of those dynamics that you're referring to. How quickly does one athlete, you know, come down, bring back down, whether it's H plus or whether it's the interaction between intracellular hydrogen ions and shifts in ion concentrations. You know, there's just a lot of interplay that I don't know how well we understand. You know, what makes the one athlete that seems to be better at this actually better in the Tour of Flanders or whatever. It's a very interesting question. I guess we just have to keep working, but at the same time be a bit humble about what we really know.
Okay. Yeah, also Veronique.
Yes, in my opinion, the problem of recovery, it depends on the muscle strength, especially in old persons who can have some sarcopenia. And you know, the DOMS depends on micro rupture of a muscle fiber. And so I think that even especially for marathon runner, it's very important to have muscle strength increase by doing some interval training with acceleration, of course. It's what I think. And in a slope, against slope, slight slope, once a week. The problem is muscle strength for me, for recovery problem. You have to increase the muscle strength.
Okay.
Can I just comment on that and ask which is more important, eccentric or concentric loading in your thoughts on this for the marathon?
Both. I think that eccentric phase is necessary for elastic energy recovery when you land on the ground. So you are right. We have to do some slope, negative and positive slope, by doing some fartlek in a natural environment with slope, negative and positive slope, both.
Okay, Henning, you also raised the hand.
Yeah, I wanted to pass on the questions to Sebastian. So Sebastian, if you have Nordic skiing, for example, given where people have to run hard up the hill and then they recover a lot. So this is a question we have in our team a lot. And you have to do that 10 times or 20 times. Or in a Tour de France, you have a race, you have tactical sprints, and then you have a time to recover. I know you've modeled a lot. I know you've worked a lot with these athletes. In your simulations or any other data that tell you, so who's the athlete who can do the same high intensity interval more often? Do you have any variable that predicts that?
I wouldn't say that there's one. I wouldn't say there's one single variable. But in cycling, and maybe especially after a meeting I had with German skiing early this week, we also had one example where maybe, unfortunately, we don't have this accurate race data in cross-country skiing like we're able to capture in cycling, right? At least what I learned in cycling is that often it's what happens is easily a misperception in terms of like when you have these repeated high intensities, basically, that it's not the guys who do have the highest really glycolytic or anaerobic power who perform the best, but actually the athletes with a little bit lower glycolytic power who in those cases, in those occasions, don't accumulate that much lactate, don't lower their pH levels that much, therefore don't have a long time with this slow component, don't have that much lowered PCR, who are doing better. Because at repeated sprints, or even a repeated sub-maximum sprint or repeated high-intensity effort, it seems to be more about the recovery in between those efforts. So it's mostly the people who can recover faster, that can be higher rate of lactate removal or lactate oxidation, to be more precise, which is basically a bigger gap between combustion and gross production. And of course, faster oxygen kinetics to recover PCR faster, depending on the duration of the effort. But in all cases I've seen, so let's put it this way, I've never seen that the highest anaerobic trained guy is the best in these intermittent high intensity exercises.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's fantastic. I mean, we have a research project on it and we scratch our head. What are the variables that explain that some person can do a relative very high workload 10 times or 5 times or 3 times? And this is a question we think about experimental paradigms and how do we study this question to study this recovery? Yeah.
But it's not only, I don't think it's only the recovery, it's also what happened during the on phase. I mean, it's purely anecdotal, but if I may share that because he's now retired, when Tony Martin joined Team Jumbo-Visma, or Lotto Jumbo at that time, they were, like, we had all this old data since he turned professional on VO2 max and VLA max and simulation and so on. They were impressed how slow his lactate accumulates once he exceeds maximum lactate steady state. So the rate at which he accumulated lactate was comparably slower compared to the average, so to speak, right? So many other pros that we're used to. So actually in the on phase, right, in the high intensity exercise, it seems like whatever, if you want to use lactate accumulation as a marker or as an important metric here, it would accumulate much slower than compared to others.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks.
Okay, so I think that we can have this discussion 2 hours more, but I think time is over now. Thanks again for this roundtable question from my side, and yeah, to all of the audience, thank you very much for participating in our symposium. And yeah, we will put all the information on the symposium on our website. I just shared my screen with our website, and yeah, and we will also upload all of the talks to YouTube, and you can get access over our website.